What do you want?
I can breathe.
The video that shocked the world and triggered a movement against police violence and racial injustice in the U.S. So, what's changed in the year since George Floyd's killing? And has justice been served? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. George Floyd wasn't the first unarmed black man to die at the hands of U.S. police officers, but the shocking video of his arrest in Minneapolis a year ago reverberated around the world and triggered what many called a global reckoning on racism.
I can't breathe.
As Officer Derek Chauvin pressed down on his neck for 9 minutes, Floyd's last words reignited longstanding anger at systematic discrimination and police brutality in the U.S. Protests for justice spread globally, forcing people to confront their own country's struggles with race and inequality. The debate is far from over, as Mike Hanna reports from Minneapolis.
Say his name! Say his name!
People gather to remember George Floyd,
King Jesus is listening when you pray.
who went out for a packet of cigarettes just under a year ago and ended up dead at the hands or knee of a white police officer.
George Floyd should not go down in history as just someone with a knee on his neck. George Floyd should go down as history that broke the neck of police racism, police brutality, and police illegality.
I will stand and be the voice for him. I will stand and be the change for him. I will stand and continue to be the legacy for him.
Find the defendant guilty.
Derek Chauvin has been found guilty of murder and manslaughter and will be sentenced on the 25th of next month.
You cannot separate justice from peace.
But the debate continues to rage as to whether meaningful police reform is taking place.
How can they reform something without including us? You can't reform anything if you don't include the people who are directly affected by it.
We want to go up a mountain, but we finally got to the base of the mountain. We've been journeying to the base, now we're at the base of the mountain, but there's still a mountain to climb.
After the rally's over, those remembering George Floyd reclaim some streets of downtown Minneapolis. The number significantly smaller than the tens of thousands who marched here in the months after the murder.
Police reform legislation remains stuck in Congress. President Biden had asked for it to be placed on his desk by the day of the anniversary on Tuesday. But then the Floyd family will visit the White House, but there will be no new laws on the desk. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Minneapolis.
All right, let's bring in our guests in Atlanta. Jill Cartwright, community organizer and campaign lead at Southerners on New Ground. In Chicago, Lester Spence, professor of political science and Africana studies at Johns Hopkins University. And in Alexandria, Virginia, Arthur Rizer, a former police officer and former prosecutor at the Department of Justice. A warm welcome to you all. Jill, let me start with you today. The fact that Derek Chauvin was found guilty of murdering George Floyd, how significant was that for Black Americans?
Thank you and good morning today. The murder of George Floyd was an egregious act that we all witnessed on video if you chose to watch. And watching Derek Chauvin go on trial for the murder that sparked and ignited a whole new movement it brought up a lot of emotions for a lot of people. And I think that still, even with having witnessed a year of a movement and having seen the video, that a lot of Black Americans and other Americans honestly still were not sure what was going to be the outcome of that trial because of what has happened in the past. And so I will say that many of us were happy to actually see the verdict delivered that we all wanted and that we needed to hear in this time. And that verdict, I think, is more than just a moment, more than just a confirmation of what we all know to be true, but it actually is a moment that shows that our movement and that our protesting and our activating and our marches and our rallies and proposing legislation and continuing to put the pressure on actually will make a difference, and that there is a possibility for accountability, for consequences for murdering Black lives. It is a step though, and many of us and many of the folks who were in the streets last year and who continue to push for reforms and for abolition know that it is just a step, and that it doesn't actually guarantee that we will see the many changes that we have advocated for, including defunding police. We know that as abolitionists that convicting police officers does not actually get us closer to being able to see those harms reduced, but we do know that it is a confirmation of all of the violence that we've experienced over this year.
Lester, George Floyd's death brought people out protesting, not just in the U.S., but all around the world, even during a pandemic. What did that say to you?
What it said was, I'm going to go back in time to 2016 when Donald Trump was elected. In the United States, a number of folk have been focusing on affect, on hope more specifically, suggesting that we needed more hope. And then after Trump was elected, it was as if hope died. What the protest nationally and globally suggested to me was something, well, actually it didn't suggest something. I always knew that we didn't really need hope. It was what we needed more was, if anything, a bit more anger. And we needed anger combined with kind of a sustained political movement. And what we saw with those protests was that in effect. That is to say, millions upon millions of people, include myself, were on the streets. And what we saw as a result is a shift, not only nationally, in the United States context, approximately 160 police reform bills have been enacted in approximately 30 states. But even globally, we've seen the conversation shift on issues, for example, related to Israel and Palestine. That's come as a large byproduct of the protests that we saw and of the movement that arguably culminated in the movement after George Floyd's death.
Arthur, how has the dialogue over policing and over police brutality and over systemic racism changed over the course of the past year in the United States?
I think the proof is going to be in the pudding, and I think that what's telling about Chauvin's conviction is not that he was convicted. Cops have been convicted in the past. I mean, this is something that we've done, actually relatively routinely, especially on the federal level. What was different for me was the way that the trial took place. Specifically, you saw the police testifying against one of their own, and they did it in a way that really did break the tradition, which was, even if you had to testify against another officer, you did it in a way that you still try to protect the profession at all costs. You protected the blue wall. You ensured that you were as resistant as possible. You saw none of that in the Chauvin trial. I mean, this is not an issue of training. This is an issue of culture. And so when I say proof is in the pudding, what we need to see is how is this the murder of George Floyd, the conviction of the officer who killed him, and then we're also going to have further trials. There's more trials coming up. How is that going to play out in the culture of policing? We have 18,000 police departments in the United States, 18,000, and each one has its own culture. So how that's going to actually play out is hard to tell. But I do think Lester said something that's pretty profound that we haven't seen in the past. Every single state that I work in has a policing bill this last year, and there's new policing bills coming up. Some of them are garbage and they're not going to do anything. Some of them are pretty profound and are actually going to have real teeth. And so I think as those play out and we see the legislation and we see culture kind of surrounding the profession to demand excellence, because I think we should demand excellence from people who carry guns, I think that is where we're going to see what the actual effect was. but there is a possibility that we're going to go back to the same old, same old. I mean, I did an interview on this station when the Ferguson riots were going on, and I remember thinking, yeah, nothing's going to change, and nothing did change. I do see some glimmers of hope. I do think this is different, and I'm looking forward to seeing some systemic changes throughout the profession of policing.
Lester, I saw you nodding along to a lot of what Arthur was saying there. Did you want to jump in and expand on the point he was making?
Yeah, just in one way. So what it's important to do, even as we're in this moment, is to think about the long deray. And it's actually not that long, right? But going back to, if you would have gone back to 2015 and a little bit before, and then use that to predict this, you're absolutely right. Like if you'd have stopped at Ferguson, you're like, wow, we've seen these protests, but nothing's happened. But the thing is what happens is movements grow and develop over time, and then they bring in more folk, right? So one thing that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about, the NBA playoffs in the United States just started this weekend. Last year, we basically saw the equivalent of a great strike by NBA players and WNBA players. Once they're galvanized, that in turn causes other people to reflect, and then that in other institutions to reflect, and that makes all types of changes possible. You know, so spinning off in another direction, we don't have the Georgia election that basically puts the Senate in the hands of the Democrats unless you have the WNBA helping to organize voters and galvanize voters in Georgia. So there are all types of spinoffs. I think Arthur is right in that the proof is in the pudding. But what what we can say is we've never seen a moment like this. And I think we're, in complicated ways, we're just getting started.
Jill, I want to talk for a minute about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, because that remains stuck in Congress right now. You know, President Biden had hoped that this would be put on his desk and ready for him to sign this legislation by the anniversary of George Floyd's killing, and it does not look right now like that is going to happen. How frustrating is that for you? What does that signify to you?
I think that we expect that when it comes to legislation and when it comes to even, as you mentioned, even a Congress that is controlled by the Democrats, I think that we can still expect some resistance and for there to be some piecemeal changes that happen over time. And of course, you know, I wholeheartedly believe that when that bill does hit President Biden's office, when it hits his desk, that he will sign it. I wholeheartedly believe that he will. The problem in that lies in that that is not what movement has asked for. Our movement, the movement for Black lives, the movement that has been led and sparked following the death of George Floyd, has called for police to be defunded. And that bill actually allocates more dollars, more funding to police departments and policing for reform in order to make sure that police can get training, police can, certain laws can pass, right? Banning chokeholds and things like that. And that's not what we asked for because we know that policing is inherently flawed. The system of policing in the United States is inherently flawed. And so what we've asked for is not the George Floyd Act. I think that to name that act after George Floyd is very bold, but what we've asked for is the Breathe Act. We're asking for legislation that actually supports and stands behind what movement is asking for, what Black organizers and leaders have dedicated our lives to studying, and the solutions that we have been able to come together and create for ourselves and for our communities from our communities. And so I think that, yes, it is frustrating to know that even legislation like the George Floyd Act is having trouble getting through Congress, right? And that it's being stopped, and that legislation actually is seeing resistance in Congress. But we also know that that legislation isn't the end goal. It doesn't encompass all of what we've been able to imagine in this miraculous past year.
Lester, let me ask you, where do things, I mean, from your perspective, stand when it comes to the Defund the Police movement? I mean, because that phrase, defund the police, has been so polarizing in the past year. Have we actually seen cuts in police budgets in different states? Are there funds that are being reinvested in community-based programs and social service programs? I mean, is there a sort of viable or tangible reimagining of public safety going on in different parts of the U.S. right now?
Yes, there are. But what you have to do is we have to drill down. Something Arthur brought up. There are 18,000 different police units. They're mostly governed by a combination of state and city law. But then even in addition to that, there are all types of, like, I'm not in Baltimore, but I live in Baltimore. And for example, one of the problems that we've had in Baltimore is that a number of institutions have tried to create private police forces, even after the 2015 or 16 protests regarding Freddie Gray. What we've seen in Baltimore is not just a significant movement to reduce the rate at which spending is increasing in policing. But in the case of an institution like my own employer, Johns Hopkins, we've effectively caused them to reverse their stance on creating a private police force. So I think that in place after place after place, although it's complicated, what we're seeing is a significant move towards not only defunding police, but removing police powers and reorienting police spending, right? We spend $500 million a year on policing in Baltimore, and we now know, and the data has always shown, that money can be put to better use. So I think we're seeing a political push for that. But again, I think we're just at the beginning.
Arthur, I want to ask you, what's the dialogue like now among police in the country? I mean, are there officers who are speaking out, officers who believe that there must be more reform within police departments? How vocal are they being? How vocal are their unions being? Has that changed?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, there actually has been a shift in the dialogue and the rhetoric of unions, which actually surprised me. That's really one of the first times I've seen unions wanting to come to the table on some of these bills that we're pushing in states and on the George Floyd Act. And Jill is absolutely right. You cannot divorce history from policing. Some of the very first police units in this country were slave hunters, but at the same time, police do feel like they're under attack, and maybe that's righteous. However, when you pit police against the people that they're supposed to be policing, you're just intensifying, you're ratcheting up that kind of combative nature. So I think that we have to start focusing on what actually will change policing in this country. And when the Ferguson riots were happening, the protests in Ferguson were happening, all the conversations were about the militarization of the police. Or why are police have this equipment? Why do they have that equipment? That isn't going to change policing. What changes policing is the culture. And when you talk about who, the chiefs of police across this country largely are highly educated, and they're kind of already bought in. It's that center mass of that leadership, the sergeants, the field trained officers. Remember, Chauvin was an FTO. I want people to imagine if those cameras weren't rolling, what would those two rookies walked away with that day? That you're allowed to murder someone and get away with it? Because that's kind of what happens in this country. That is what's happened historically in this country. So we have to really focus on the culture side of it. And the way that you do that is not creating an environment where, if I start a conversation with you about the problems in journalism, and I said, well, let's start by saying we're going to reduce your salary. Now let's have a conversation. Nobody wants to participate in that. So I think the focus really needs to be on, what should be the police mission? And if that's the conversation, then let's have it. And I'm all about it. But if we start off by saying, oh, we want to defund the police, now let's have a conversation. Nobody wants to come to that table. And poll after poll after poll has said that this is a loser. You're actually alienated, not just cops, you're alienating the voting public. And President Obama has talked about it. President Biden has talked about it. We really need to have pragmatic solutions. And those solutions really do revolve around the culture aspect, and specifically talk about what should be the police mission. And as a society, if we want to reduce violent cops, then we need to implement things that reduce violent cops. And just having conversations that revolve around rhetoric don't actually do that.
Jill, the Black Lives Matter movement got this huge surge in support in the wake of George Floyd's killing. Where does that support stand right now? I mean, do you get any sense that momentum has waned at all in the United States?
Not at all. I think that obviously over time, the streets do begin to empty. Like you mentioned, even the protesters, the amount of folks that we saw in the streets in Minneapolis leading up to George Floyd's, the anniversary of his murder, was tens of thousands less than we had seen last year, right? And I think that we often confuse a moment of whirlwind, which is a moment of crisis, a moment where there is a major event happening that folks are responding to. We often confuse that with the movement. And movement work actually is a protracted sort of work. It's the kind of work that takes time and the kind of work that mostly happens behind doors, of talking to people, of meeting with legislators, drafting our demands, and being able to actually build that kind of power that you saw last year. That power had built over time. And I think that obviously the conditions of where we were with COVID-19 happening, with mass unemployment, with many folks frustrated and out of jobs and just not seeing themselves being held and being protected under those conditions of the pandemic, I think also contributed to that frustration, But yes, there is large support for the movement for Black Lives. When we were polling, since we're talking about polling numbers, I wanted to also mention that we did a lot of our own polling ahead of the Georgia runoff election, which I was a part of and my organization was a part of. And we were actually to poll voters, and the issues that were important to the movement for Black Lives were top line issues of fixing racial justice, addressing racial justice, being able to attack the health disparities based on race and maternal mortality and all of these issues that are explicitly tied to racism in this country. And so the support is still there. It may not look like people marching in the streets right now, but I think that when you look at the details, the devil is in the details. If there weren't support for defunding police, then we would not see so many municipalities across the country, large and small. We're talking about small towns in Oklahoma to large cities like New York and Seattle and LA defunding their police departments, because that's the demand that came from the movement and from the grassroots. And that's actually a defensive demand. We're on the defense because police departments have been antagonizing communities for centuries. And so this is a measure that we can take to say we're going to actually put those funds where our folks will be protected and where we'll get the kind of services we need to not have to be policed so aggressively.
Lester, we only have a couple of minutes left. It looked to me like you wanted to jump in and add to what Jill was saying, but I also want to ask you about the fact that, so many commentators over the course of the past year have said that America is at an inflection point, or they have said that there is a racial reckoning that is going on in the country. Do you believe that that is something that is actually taking place in America right now?
Well, it's not just a racial reckoning, it's an economic reckoning. So if you go back to 1929 to now, we've got more inequality now than we did during the Great Depression. So we really are at an inflection point. Like, I myself lost 16, 17 people to COVID, right? Like folks in my family. So I think that it's only at real crisis moments like these where we can see significant movement, where we can see the type of culture shift that Arthur's calling for. But the thing is that those culture shifts, whether we're talking about in policing, whether we're talking about within the Democratic Party, they tend to come as a result of political movement. So it's not that institutions reform themselves. That just isn't how it functions. Oftentimes, what institutions like policing, institutions like multinational corporations, institutions like political parties, they require political action from outside of them in order to move them in the direction that we need to go to make this whole structure more humane. And I think that's what we're seeing. Again, we're only at the beginning, and to be fair, because of this inflection point, we can easily go the other direction. If you look at what the Republican Party is doing in the United States, and even if you extend that to think about what's going on in Turkey, what's going on in Israel, what's going on in the UK, what's going on in Brazil, we're at the beginning of the beginning. But hopefully y'all don't take this part, but I actually have hope. That's the only time I'll ever say that on any type of media. I actually have hope that we're going in the right direction.
All right, well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the discussion there. Thank you so much to all of our guests, Jill Cartwright, Lester Spence, and Arthur Rizer. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see this and all of our previous programs again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.